Greetings and welcome to The Stone Live, also known as The Stone Call. It's Sunday, May 3rd, 2020, and I'm Peter Catapano, an editor for the New York Times opinion section. The Stone is a forum for contemporary philosophers and other thinkers to discuss issues, both timely and timeless, as the slogan goes. Today's call is called, "This Isn't the Good Place, so how can we make it better?" Before we begin, a quick note to the listeners on the call. We want to hear from you, so please submit questions in writing at any time during the event using the Q&A feature in Zoom. You should see it there on your screen. Also, please note this event is being recorded, so anything you type can and will be held against you. I'm just kidding. It definitely won't. And we're happy to take your toughest ethical questions. So let's get started. I'm being joined as usual by Simon Critchley. Simon is a philosopher, New School professor, author, David Bowie worshiper, and Liverpool football fanatic, and also the Stone's moderator. We're very excited to have our first guest on the Stone Call, Todd May. Todd is a philosopher, author of many wonderful books, and was an advisor to the TV show The Good Place. He's also the author of many essays for The Stone. He's been involved with this project from almost the very beginning, so I want to thank him for that, including one essay published last week called "What is Keeping You Home Right Now?" Wasn't the greatest title, but we tried. Todd will do a better job at explaining the piece, which explored our ethical obligations during the pandemic and beyond. We're going to discuss that and as much as we can today. Welcome to the Stone Call, Todd.
Thanks, Peter. It's good to be here.
Great.
Hi, Todd.
Hey,
Hi,
Simon.
Good to speak to you.
Good to be in touch with you again.
Yes, Simon and Todd have a long history of arguing together, which I hope we'll get to a little bit here. So I want to begin with a question for Todd. You began your piece with a rundown of the ethical reasons we have for staying inside and away from others during the pandemic, not just to prevent us from getting sick, but to prevent the spread of the coronavirus to other people. You contend that by making this decision, we put ourselves in something we call an ethical web. What do you mean by an ethical web?
Well, Peter, when I was writing the article, this term kind of popped up for me, and I looked it up on the internet to make sure it hadn't already been used. And when people were using the term ethical web, what they meant was like being a nice guy when you're on the internet, and that's not where I was headed. The idea is this: that if we think that we ought to stay home or keep social distance from folks in order not simply to protect ourselves, but also protect them. We'd be protecting people that we don't even know, people that we just are running across in the store or on the street. Then we think we have some kind of obligation to folks not to put them in really dangerous situations. And so that, it seems to me, implies more than just what we're doing in the virus. It also implies that when we are potentially putting people in dangerous situations, we ought to do something to try to prevent that. And that, to me, is the beginnings of thinking that we're in an ethical web of relationships to one another, not just a web where we happen to be in the same society, but a web in which we think that we have obligations to one another, people we know, but also people we don't know.
Mm-hmm. Isn't that something you feel already exists in day-to-day life and existed before this happened? How do you think that this situation should change the way we look at that?
No, you're right, Peter. It certainly existed beforehand, and I think people were more or less aware of it. But I think what the virus has done is really brought it out in a way that we can see it. Oftentimes, as we're going through our day, we don't think terribly much about our ethical obligation to others, which doesn't mean we don't act ethically. It's that we don't reflect on it. And what the virus has done is really put us in a situation where we can reflect on those obligations. And if we begin to reflect on those obligations, they may open up a space that will show us that we have obligations that we haven't thought about.
Yeah. So something else I wanted to bring up was I mentioned your participation as an advisor to the show, The Good Place.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people listening know the TV show. You even had a great cameo on the show's last season where you correct Kristen Bell on a point in a text you've written, which must have been a lot of fun. But I think everybody sort of knows that the show used moral philosophy as its sort of central theme to illustrate the ways our actions and relationships with others gave life meaning. I was reading an interview not long ago with the show's creator, Michael Schur, and he said the motivating idea from the show came from the concept that we owe certain things to other people. And the job of being alive on Earth is to figure out what you owe to them and how you can provide it for them. That's the only way that there will ever be any progress. So it was pretty clear on the show that caring for others among the characters gave life meaning. And it's obviously the intention of your essay, but where does your basic belief that this is the way to live or a way to live actually come from? Is it something you picked up in your studies, from a book, from some person, or some lesson you learned in life?
Good. This is a great question, Simon. I'm sorry, Peter. Peter, would it be okay if I just Simon's the guy with the British accent? So if I just
who's being remarkably quiet at this point.
I know. All you're doing is letting me have enough rope until you just.
Right. I'm just waiting, just waiting.
being patient. A side note from the show, just from the cameo, which is that I had two lines, which of course I was petrified about. And in one of the lines, as you noted, I corrected Kristen Bell. And I corrected Kristen Bell with the wrong line. They had the wrong line in the script. And so I corrected Kristen Bell, and I was thinking afterwards, I remember this from my book. And sure enough, it wasn't there. So I emailed Mike Schur, and I said, Mike, I think there's a small problem here. And I had to go into a studio and re-record. And so they synced it with the show. But that's to the side. As far as thinking about ethics and meaning goes, I don't want to say, and I don't think that Mike means this either, that ethics is the way to a meaningful life or a way in itself to a meaningful life. It seems to me that it's an important part of having a meaningful life. And one of the reasons for that is that our ethics involves our relationships to one another. And in involving our relationships to one another, it involves things that we owe to people we care about that we can extend out to other people that we don't know, or that we haven't cared about, or that we don't have any kind of deep relationship to. I mean, if you think back to the show, what makes people become more ethical as the seasons move on is through their relationships with one another. Right? It's through their caring for one another that they begin to see their way to acting more ethically with people that they know, and eventually people that they don't know. That idea is, and it was consciously this for Mike Schur, that idea is very Aristotelian, right? For Aristotle, we become good through the kinds of situations we find ourselves in with one another. We help one another be good. So having a meaningful life with relationships with others and having an ethical life aren't two separate things. They're woven together. Even though having a meaningful life doesn't mean you have to be solely acting ethically.
Well, you mentioned acting in the interest of people who are close to you, and then obviously people who are much removed from you. So I mean, I know my feeling when a crisis happens is that I want to protect my family and those around me first. I want to protect myself first, even though I may feel like I have certain set of ethics that I want to follow and that I want other people to flourish as well. I'm much more likely in a situation like this to be looking out for myself. So in a situation that we have now where almost everybody's under a sort of existential threat, how do you see navigating that?
Good. Yeah. Let me start, Peter, with a general philosophical point and then move specifically to the issue of the virus. Right? The philosopher David Hume said that the way that we develop ethically is that we start with the sympathy with those around us, or empathy with people around us. That's to say, we feel connected to people around us. We feel a bit of what they're feeling, and that leads to an ethical sensibility. And the trick, according to Hume, is to move that ethical sensibility from people we know, right, outwards to people that we don't know. And so if that's the case, then there isn't necessarily a conflict between privileging your family and having ethical obligations to folks outside. There can be conflicts, which I'll get to in a minute, but there isn't a necessary conflict between one and the other. Now, the coronavirus is for us a case, or at least for me, a case where acting on behalf of your family and acting on behalf of others is, in most situations, it's the same thing, right? Mm-hmm. Keeping social distance from others will be one of the ways in which you help your family. So for many of us, and there are exceptions I'm going to get to in a minute, but for many of us, right, there isn't a conflict between acting ethically toward others, right, keeping your distance, and protecting your family. Now, there are at least two groups of people for whom it is a conflict, and it's a tragic conflict. Right? One group is medical professionals. Mm-hmm. Medical professionals are in a situation where to act on behalf of people that they don't know, they could be putting people that they care about in danger. And a lot of medical professionals have tried to distance themselves from their family while they're engaged in that kind of work. Mm-hmm. I think another even more tragic situation relative to this conflict is the people who have to go to work to make a living. People who are working in stores, people who are working, say, on roads or doing things that put them necessarily in contact with others because that's the only way they can afford to feed their families. Right? Those are people who don't have much of a choice either about going to work or about coming home to their families. Right? They can't afford to stay someplace else. So they, I think, are in a tragic situation of conflict. And I think that, by the way, would oblige us as a society to do what we can to mitigate that conflict by trying to provide them as much safety equipment as possible, by trying to limit those jobs jobs that are necessary to do, and to give them, right, and the kind of recognition that people like that deserve. In a recent column in the Times, Michael Sandel said that we sometimes, right, think that we live in a meritocratic society that's just based on merit. But in living in that society, right, we fail to recognize that many of the people who get what's called the merit are people who have been fortunate in the first place. And what we're discovering through the virus is that many of the most essential people to making our society go are people who are working in jobs that get very little pay and very little reward. And if I could take just one more step with this, right? This is something that's not simply with the virus. Like let's say I write a book, right? I feel like I've accomplished something. I've written a book. It's out there, right, in the world. It's my accomplishment. But I would never have gotten to my office with somebody fixing the roads. I would never have been able to write my book without somebody keeping the lights on, right, and sweeping my office. I would never have been able to write the book if there wasn't somebody that I couldn't buy food from, right? And so all of these people are essential. And in this moment, right, they're in a tragic conflict. And I worry that they're not being rewarded and recognized, right, for having to be in that conflict.
Yeah. Can I jump in here, Peter?
Please, Simon.
Right.
Very interesting stuff. And, I've been thinking, I mean, this is less, the ethical web idea you've got in the article. I want to come back to that. But I've been thinking about, when we think about morality, particularly when we think about morality in terms of, moral philosophy, there are three main theories that tend to get taught. One is utilitarianism. The other is what's called deontology, based on some conception of duty. and some idea of virtue ethics. And just to say that, and just to ask you a question about the oddness of our situation, because it seems to me that we're living in a situation where all three of those theories are operative and are all deficient in different ways. You know, so for example, if we think about utilitarianism, right? The idea that the greatest happiness of the greatest number, a broadly quantitative idea of goodness, and that's undoubtedly what's going on in with triage, with who gets the ventilator,
Yep.
who gets the masks. We're counting numbers, and in order, and there's been some testimony from doctors and healthcare professionals about, in a sense, in order to deal with this situation, they've had to shut themselves down to the humanity of the people that they're treating, because it's just too much. So we're in a kind of, at one level, we're in a kind of weird utilitarian situation where we're deciding how many, who, and we're all trying to keep the numbers down. This is a utilitarian argument. The second argument, which is in the air, is more of a an argument we could say follows from someone like Kant. We have a duty to follow the rules, right? Think of others and not of ourselves. Stay home. Or today, the United Kingdom government, this is on Instagram, and this is their message for Sunday. We must keep going. We must keep going. Stay at home, as you say in your piece. These are moral imperatives which we think have a force not just applying to ourselves, but on others, and maybe all others. Maybe the perspective of humanity that you allude to in your text at the end of it. And the third theory is virtue ethics. And you mentioned Aristotle. This is usually associated with Aristotle. And we're finding virtue in the figure of the doctor, the nurse, the essential worker, and maybe, to some extent, this is a question, the leader, right? Maybe Cuomo at some point. And the idea there is that ethics consists in the possession and display of virtue and doing the right thing in the right way at the right time. And it seems to me that we're using all three of those moral theories, when it kind of suits us in different situations, and getting muddled about the whole picture at some level. And then the really big question, this comes back to, that's a kind of general thought in relationship to the argument you make about, say, the ethical web, which is, that, let's say that's right? That's a justified position. We're all part of an ethical web. We could say that's a realist description of the way things are, and it also has a certain force, and what philosophers would call a normative force. But then the question is, why should one follow it? How does one motivate someone to act on that? This is the oldest kind of moral problem there is, which isn't that we can justify our moral beliefs one way or another. We could be utilitarians, Aristotelians, Kantians, take your pick. But how you motivate someone to act on the basis of a certain view is the tricky thing. And in the situation that we're in now, there's two sort of glaring problems. There's the problem of the person that says, well, you've got your ethical web, whatever, and I'm going to drive my SUV into Lansing and wave the stars and stripes, and that's my freedom, and you can't stop me. How does one deal with that moral argument? And then I want to get to this a little bit further on, is really what on earth is going on with the malignant narcissist who is the president of this country in terms of the issues of responsibility when it comes to government. That's a separate issue. What do you think about that bundle of things, Todd?
Yeah, Simon, let me separate it into three things and then put one to the side. I want to take the malignant narcissist and put him to the side for a moment. Thank God. Yeah, right. I would like to put him to the side for lots of moments, but that's not up to me. Right. The question in some sense, Simon, goes to two levels, right? One is we have these different moral theories, So how do we sort them out
Mm-hmm.
in the situations in which we find ourselves in? That's one. The second question, the one that you raised second, was what philosophers call why be moral?
Yeah.
And let me address that one first,
Okay.
because I've always thought that that's a bad question. Because to ask why be moral is to suppose that you have to have a non-moral reason to get into morality in the first place,
Mm-hmm.
because you've got to lay all the moral reasons aside, and because otherwise you're just arguing in a circle. And it seems to me that for most people, being moral, being decent, is something that's deep for them. That is a deep sense of who they are. If you're unwilling to be moral or to think that that's an important aspect of who you should be, I'm not sure that there's any argument that's going to get you there.
Right.
And I don't like the arguments that try. So I know that that's a traditional question in philosophy. I just think it's what philosophers call a badly formed question. I
Okay.
don't understand it, right?
Okay.
The other question is how we sort out these theories. And I think that it's right that no theory covers all the ground, right? So utilitarianism is probably necessary in the very difficult situation where doctors have to make triage decisions. Some kind of utilitarianism is necessary. But it doesn't seem, if we're going to switch that over to opening up society, that we can take a utilitarian stance that simply, well, this many lives we can sacrifice for this much life satisfaction for the people who are working. That seems to me to start to be an inappropriate way
how much death
to
is
approach
tolerable
it.
before we open up the economy becomes the, yeah.
Right. I mean, it's surely the case, Simon, that that opening up society does put people at risk, and that there will be some risk associated with it. I just don't think we sort it out simply by using utilitarian terms. I think I think that's an inappropriate way to think about it.
Okay.
So we think about it. We can think about it in other terms, maybe some more deontological, which is to say, how do we think about this by trying to have respect for everyone? That's the kind of Kantianism that I like, rather than the blind duties. But the Aristotelian question is an interesting and different one to me. Whereas when we're thinking about utilitarianism, we're thinking about what the consequences of my act are. If we're thinking about Kantianism, we're thinking about how can I act in such a way as to respect others. With Aristotelianism, I think one of the questions that we're asking ourselves is, who am I as a person, right? What kind of person would I like to be? And here I think the virus is also throwing us back on ourselves. When we see people who are vulnerable, we're asking, how can I help them? And in asking, how can I help them, I think we're implicitly, at least, asking ourselves questions of what kind of person should I be? And that, to me, I think is an important question, but a question that isn't simply the question of acts in particular situations in the virus. Simon, does that last part make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. But then you've got, I mean, how do you, or do you, I mean, would you say it's, I mean, there's this classic, philosophical chestnut, sometimes called the moral problem, right?
Right.
And it goes something like this. So I can say, I think that famine is bad, right? Famine is a really bad thing. People are dying of famine. That's awful. And I'm completely persuaded of that as a view. And to be a decent person would be someone who would try to reduce famine as widely as possible, and to give as much from my, let's say, income to make that possible. And then, then there's a knock on the door, and it's the famine relief people. And I'm watching The Good Place, let's say. I'm watching The Good Place on Netflix. And I think, oh, I can't be bothered. I can't be bothered to get up. I'll just pretend I'm not here. This is the kind of free rider problem, right? So the problem is how we can have an idea of decency. Yeah, we'd all love to be decent. Think of ourselves as decent people. But how you motivate someone to act on that basis is the really tricky thing, right? Unless you built it in some deep sense of moral dispositions.
Good. Simon, let me say first, before I address the question, that the fact that you're watching The Good Place on Netflix and not watching it live when it comes out, I think is already a moral problem.
Hey, I have to jump in here and let you guys know that it's actually streaming on Hulu. So
Okay.
I just needed to clear that up.
Okay.
All right.
So that aside, right? I think, Simon, there's not a general philosophical answer to that question.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, there are folks out there in different places, in different situations. And some of them owe a lot more and should be shamed. And that would be a proper way to get them to get them motivated. Jeff Bezos, for instance, right? Who, when the fires were raging in Australia, offered what, $600,000.
Yeah.
It seems to me that there's a role for shaming there, but there's a lot of places in which there, I think, is not a role for shaming, but rather for helping people see, bringing them along, praising them for what they're doing. Simon, I've done a lot of political organizing, and one of the things that I emphasize is that when a person comes to a rally or does something good, right, you don't tell them what they're not doing, right? You praise them. They can feel good about it. They feel as though they've made a change, and so they then can go on and then think, okay, this is a little bit more of what I want to do, or a little bit more of who I want to be. So I think there isn't a general answer of how you motivate somebody to be more ethical. I think that there's a role for shame, there's a role for encouragement, there's a role for, let's say, guilt, which is not the same thing as shame. So it seems to me that it's going to depend on how.
What about this, Todd? What about this? What about the person? This comes back to our malignant narcissist friend. What do you do with someone that experiences no shame, and no shame, and therefore no responsibility? And I was thinking about this in relationship to Hannah Arendt in the last few days, and Hannah Arendt's famous argument about the banality of evil when she's looking at Eichmann. And when she's looking at Eichmann, she's looking at someone in her eyes who is what's terrible about Eichmann is that he's thoughtless. He's kind of stupid. He's just following along. And it's the thoughtlessness of evil in that sense that it kind of is the kind of the thought behind the banality of it. Now, when you think of someone like, Trump, I mean, the astonishing thing about him as a being is the absence of shame, the absence of responsibility, certainly no guilt, and so on and so forth. I mean, and that has a knock-on effect in terms of leadership, the people in the kind of the circle of loyalty which he has around him, and so on and so forth. And I don't know how you would trigger an experience of shame in such a moral character.
Good. I think, Simon, there's two levels of discussion here. Let me isolate them, right? One is cultural, one psychological. Right?
Okay.
The cultural issue, I think, plays in Germany with things like Eichmann in Jerusalem as well. In Germany, there was a culture of obedience and of following orders that I think played and made it easier for Eichmann to do what he did. Now, if we look at the U.S., right, what we see is a culture of individualism. So I remember an interview one time with a Norwegian where he was saying, in the Scandinavian countries, we have an obligation-based culture.
Right.
Whereas in the US, you have a rights-based culture. So I think there's a cultural issue driving this as well. Now, having said that, I want to distinguish some of those people who are shown at these rallies who are acting on the basis of a rights-based culture and the psychological claim that I want to make around Trump, who is a sociopath, right? And, well, I don't mean that. I mean that very clinically, right?
Exactly.
That he is clearly unable to have empathy with other human beings.
Absolutely.
That didn't come out just in the virus. That came out for me in a very salient way with the way he treated his wife, who I'm not a fan of his wife, but he allowed her to be humiliated during that period where he was accused of having affairs. Now, a person who is a sociopath, who has no ability to engage with any kind of empathy toward others is going to be incapable of being moral. Remember when we talked about morality, we said that involves relationships with others.
Absolutely.
And so I think he can't do it. He simply can't. And it seems to me the best thing you do with a person like that is you just try to isolate them, because you're not going to make them moral.
Okay.
It's time for me to step in there.
All right, it's already getting moving on, right?
I knew once you two got talking that time would go very quickly, and we would end up probably where we ended up. But we have hundreds of people listening in, readers, listeners who were kind enough to join us today, and we have some questions.
Great.
Todd, the way this works is I have the questions coming up in front of me, and I will ask them. I imagine most of them will be directed toward you, but Simon, welcome to chime in on.
No, let's this is Todd's.
We do have a guest, so we should
absolutely
behave ethically toward our guest.
Absolutely. I've said enough.
You guys are such great hosts.
And thanks.
I'm going to come back.
If we come back. Okay, so the other thing I'll say, Todd, is we want to try to keep the answers pretty short, because I probably have 6 or 7 questions lined up, but I'm gonna start right now. We have Kathy, who wrote in to ask, what about those who don't believe in this virus and think it's all made up? Where is their ethics or their ethical web?
Good. This opens up to a question that will relate them, as Kathy probably knows, to the anti-vaxxers, right? People who are looking at reality and just not seeing it. And I think this goes to the larger question of self-deception. I sometimes tell my classes that people's ability knowingly to do evil is pretty limited, but people's capacity for self-deception is almost infinite. And so in this case, you have a fairly studied self-deception, and I'm not sure what changes it. I know that in the gay rights movement, one of the things that changed people was when people in their families came out as gay. What I wonder is, in this situation, whether they're going to have to know somebody who gets ill before they begin to admit that it's really a thing.
Yeah. Okay, we have a question from Chelsea Lee. She asks, I think you and Simon were getting at this a little. This might be an opportunity to take it a little further. What do you say to the individuals who consider themselves exempt from the moral obligation to treat other people well? This was something you started talking about it, this idea as a cultural thing, maybe as an American thing. We had a piece by James Traub, the writer James Traub, a couple of weeks ago, called Our Pursuit of Happiness is
Killing the Planet. Right?
Killing the Planet. And the idea that he raised was that there is actually something written into the foundations of the American Code, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that has come to mean the pursuit of private pleasures, or maybe in this case, private well-being. So, in light of all that, what do you think of Chelsea Lee's question?
Good. Yeah, it's a really good question. 2 things. One is, I think that the idea of the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness is right, but I also think that it has been emphasized much more in the last 40 years, in the period that we call the neoliberal period, in which individualism has been much more on the agenda than it was, say, during the period of what's sometimes called the welfare state. But the other thing is this. I think there are people, say people who show up at these rallies, who don't see themselves as being unethical, who might actually do things that we think of as ethical, but they also have a deep sense of their own rights. And those rights, they believe, can override a set of other obligations that most of the rest of us think are ethical. And now let me say this, right? They're getting a lot of play and they're getting a lot of coverage, but they're not getting a lot of support, right? The overwhelming majority of Americans think that if anything, we're opening up too soon, right? Rather than too late. So I don't want to take the folks who are more marginal to this discussion and make them more central than they actually are.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We have one question here. I think it's definitely directed to you. There's a little challenge to your early work in here, so I want to serve this up to you. Eileen says that Todd has argued before in The Stone that the extinction. You'll have to clarify this if this is
Right.
not exactly right. That the
Okay.
extinction of the human species might be, quote unquote, a good thing, even as it would be a tragedy. If we granted this philosophical premise, doesn't it follow that the pandemic, as an engine of destruction of humanity worldwide, is a tragedy that could bring the world at least a better, if not a good place?
Good.
Good question.
It's a really good question. The idea I was trying to press in the article was that that it might be better off if, and again, that word "might" is crucial, if we weren't here. But that left aside a whole lot of other questions, which
Yeah.
is the modes in which, right, extinction would take place, right, the kinds of pains involved, a series of other things. I don't think the mere fact of having fewer people and the way that we're having fewer people goes to anything that I was trying to get at in the article. I got a lot of pushback on that article. In the second paragraph, there's a series of questions that need to be answered that this article is not answering. And one of them is, well, even if we grant that it would be a better thing, how would that come about without a set of ethical problems? And the viruses certainly would not be the way for it to come about. And we're seeing the kinds of pain involved for people who have the virus and for people who care for them.
Yeah. We have a question from Mary that actually is a perfect follow-up to this. She says that in less than 2 months, with humans doing less, meaning under lockdown, shutdown, the world of nature is thriving without the overcrowding of humans. There's been a bunch of very interesting articles on how wildlife is sort of re-emerging in various places throughout the world. So is this pandemic a global wake-up call? Is it time for us to reinvent ourselves to become more ethically aware as humans?
Good. This could go either of a couple directions, and I don't want to make a prediction on this, and I'll tell you why. I'm a very bad predictor. When I was a freshman in college, there was the university I went to had a habit of getting really good bands before they broke. So we went to watch this band of like 200 people. The venue was so small, I had to open the door to let the band in. And I opened it, I let the band in. And I turned to my friend and I got to chatting with the band a minute. I said, well, that's the best I'll ever do, some small time rocker from Asbury Park. So that was Springsteen, and that's my predictive ability.
Okay.
So it seems to me it can go
Duly noted.
either of at least two ways. One way it could go is as a wake-up call, that we begin to realize our place in the larger ethical web, which doesn't simply now include other human beings, but can include other animals and nature. That's one way where it could go. The other way that it could go, though, is in a more self-serving, self-protective way that goes back, Peter, to the question you asked me earlier. Look, I'm going to protect me and mine, and I'm not going to worry about anybody else, because that will be the lesson I'll take away from the pandemic. And I don't know which way we're going to go. I think we're a bit in the balance at this moment.
Yeah.
Let me ask Simon, do you want to jump in on that? That'd be a question for you as well.
Yeah, I think the jury is out. I mean, as you know, as the leader of the People's Republic of China said in the late 40s or early 50s, when he was asked about the French Revolution, do you think the French Revolution was a good thing or a bad thing? So it's too soon to tell.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of that. I mean, I think that it would be lovely if this were a wake-up call, and I think that also the capacity to forget, the need to readjust, the capacity to forget, the fact that humankind can bear very little reality, as T.S. Eliot says, is also in my mind.
Yeah. Donovan writes in to ask, For those who recoil at the idea of sacrificing their freedom to a common good, how could we reframe the situation such that the decision to limit our activities can be seen as an instance of our free action instead of being an imposition on our freedom? That's rather deep. That's rather deep, Donovan.
That's
Thank
a good
you.
question.
Yeah.
That's positive versus negative freedom right there, right?
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, but it's also, I think, well, one aspect of it's more individual. Coming back to what I was saying to Simon earlier, this will depend in part on who you have, but I think that there is a sense among folks, and I want to be really careful because this could be a really slippery slope.
Yeah.
But among a lot of the folks who are sort of wanting to assert their rights, they also identify as part of a community, right? A community that they call the American community. And surely they feel that one of our tasks is to contribute to the health of that community. And in contributing to the health of that community, not getting other people sick is one way that they can do it. So they can show respect for the health of the community itself. Now, the slippery slope, and I'm sure everybody sees this, is, well, does that mean that we only have to care about the American community, right? And I would say no, but at least there's a starting point in saying to people who are in the name of America saying, I'm going to assert my rights, to open up a conversation about what the health of that community, right, that they're valuing looks like.
Can I just add something tiny to that as well, Todd?
Yeah,
Because what's interesting is not that this has been thought through or theorized necessarily, but it's interesting to me how when we ask the question, Sandel's question, what do we owe to each other as citizens? What people have fallen back into is a kind of national structure. People have, when you're looking around the world, you're seeing people retreat within their national borders. I mean, where I'm from, the UK, it's all about protect the National Health Service, protect the National Health Service. And so what do we owe, what do we owe Danes or Italians? And then what do we owe Brazilians and Indonesians? It's really not clear. So there's a sense in which one can have a robust idea of moral sentiment, but it seems to be restricted within a kind of national framework, which is worrying, right?
Yeah.
Okay, we have a perennial question that's come in from Stefan. Not sure you two can answer this, but we'll give it a try. What can philosophy and or philosophers contribute during this trying time? Silence.
Good. That's good. No, this is good. I guess I noted it looks like this is the last one we get to answer. So I got to answer. I answered quickly, although it's a great question that I could go on. Well,
I think I'm not sure if we're gonna have to end exactly in 2 minutes.
Okay.
So let's talk and we'll see if we get the red signal.
Okay, good.
Okay.
I mean, certainly, philosophers as human beings have plenty that we can contribute, right? Which is to say, helping people who are unemployed, helping people who are alone and at home, helping the elderly, what everybody can do, right? But the question really goes to philosophers. And I think what philosophy allows us to do is reflect on ourselves and our situation, right? So it's something that we all do, but philosophers often will do it more rigorously. Why? Because this is something that we get paid to do every day. And so what I tried to do, say, in the piece that I wrote, was to say that if we step back and reflect, there's something that we might see that we're missing in our everyday, often missing in our everyday interaction. So I think what philosophy can do is give us tools to reflect on what we're doing and who we are. And then we as now just human beings, can use those tools in order to be able to direct our lives in ways that would be like healthier for us or more fulfilling for us. One of the things, Peter, that seems could be really tragic in a life is when you get to the end of it and then you say, man, I just regret it. I shouldn't have lived like that. Mm-hmm. But what philosophy allows us to do is engage in the kind of reflection so our lives don't end up there. And that's something that can help us, I think, with the virus, but also help us moving forward in our lives in a larger sense.
Yeah.
I just add a tiny bit to that because
Sure.
this is a philosophical moment. It's an unasked for philosophical moment, right? Something has happened, and it's thrown us back on ourselves, and it's revealed a desperate need to reflect on the deep questions of the nature of a life and why one does what one does. So people like me and Todd, I know, believes this too. Everyone's a philosopher. It's not that we're some kind of little, we're not specialists. We're not like car mechanics. We're just making explicit tendencies which everybody has. So, and this is a deeply philosophical moment, it seems to me, which none of us kind of asked for, but here we are, and we can try and make sense of it together.
I agree, and let me say this: we haven't talked about this, but this is also in the background as a philosophical issue, which is our relation to death, which Simon, you wrote about a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you both. That is going to be the last question, it appears. And I just want to end by saying thank you very much to Todd and to Simon. Thank you for your work, both of you, and coming here today to talk to all of us.
Let me thank Todd as well. Absolutely. Thank you for coming on, Todd.
Well, and let me thank both of you, Simon, for your work, and Peter for your work on putting philosophical issues out there in the public, which is the place they ought to be.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A very ethical ending to this conversation. This conversation is a part of a larger slate of digital events at the Times that we're producing to help readers navigate the world that we find ourselves in today. Tomorrow, Monday, May 4th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, you can hear from the Beijing Bureau Chief, Stephen Lee Myers, and diplomatic correspondent Edward Wong as they discuss China's reopening. To see all of the upcoming digital events, please visit Times Events at nytimes.com. And thank you to our subscribers who make our work possible. We look forward to speaking with you again. With that, I will sign off and hopefully speak with you all next week. Bye-bye.